Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, InaneDragon. Tonight, we look at a video that was provided to me by the one, the only, the Rev Jr., whose YouTube channel is linked in the description. He was rightly infuriated by this nonsense, but too busy to tackle it himself. Luckily, I'm way behind in production and could use a little fodder while I get my feet back under me. Here we have the Venerable Reverend David Rives misrepresenting evolution, Richard Dawkins, and so much more.
The atheist Richard Dawkins once proposed a very interesting idea. He said that he believed that ducks and hawks evolved quickly through a self-feeding mechanism of necessity.
Here's the thing, David Rives is already lying. Dawkins' only use of the phrase self-feeding is from a lecture he gave in 1991. From what I was able to find researching for this video, he uses it in none of his books, and it appears nowhere in the peer-reviewed literature, either in articles he wrote or other articles. In this one lecture, he does use self-feeding coevolution as a shorthand for the sort of evolutionary arms race you see wherein prior adaptations lay the groundwork for future adaptations. However, he doesn't propose it as an explanation of hawks and ducks. He uses hawks and ducks as an established example of where this process has occurred, alongside a few examples of analogous processes in human technologies to make the topic more easily understood. His whole point is to propose the idea that the human brain may have been the product of a similar process. Here's Dawkins.
Arms races happen in evolution as well. Here's a peregrine falcon, which is flying along, beautiful piece of flying machinery, and soon it's going to see some prey, which it's going to dive to attack. Here it is, the wings go in, it screams down at nearly 100 miles an hour on its prey, which in this case happens to be a duck, also flying very fast. The duck's flying fast, there it comes. Both the duck and the hawk are end products of a long evolutionary arms race. Both of them are extremely good at flying, and the reason is that the other one is. In their ancestry, improvements on one side necessitated improvements on the other. As hawks got better, ducks had to get better. And as ducks got better, hawks had to get better. So indirectly, there was the improvements in the hawks that made their descendants have to get even better later. And improvements in the ducks made their descendants have to get even better later. That's why I call it self-feeding.
Just prior, he'd given the example in human weaponry of missiles and missile interceptors to make the point in a way that would be obvious to anyone. But I think that this example of the duck and hawk is just as clear. What's most clear is that contra Rives, it is not being introduced as a new idea that he's speculating about, but an established and accepted evolutionary approach. I'm skipping Rives' use of examples from human technology to try and explain what Dawkins was talking about, because I think Dawkins did a good enough job explaining the concept himself. I'll only note that in order to make his video work, Rives avoids mentioning any accepted examples of evolutionary arms races that he may have found in the academic literature, and only presents human technology as achieving such results. If you doubt my honesty, his link is in the description below.
So logically, it seems that self-feeding works, that we could apply the same to biological evolution, that a hawk and its prey could create a bit of a rapid spiral of development to outcompete. One gets faster and better at evading, and the other gets keener eyes and sharper talons. The cycle continues. It seems logical, right? Well, just because something makes sense doesn't make it true, and I'm sure that Dawkins would be quick to admit that. But let's look more closely at the proposed self-feeding, upwards rapid evolution, and we're going to see that this is just an average piece of intellectual pseudoscience. In fact, the only examples Dawkins gives are based on human intellect.
Do you see what I mean by dishonest? As I've demonstrated by playing the lecture Dawkins gave, one of his examples is the coevolution of hawks and ducks. Rives could have argued that the example was invalid, but it's not what's happening here. Rives is actively denying the very reason Dawkins brought up hawks and ducks in a lecture about the evolution of the human brain. Now let's be fair. I want evidence as much as the next guy. So is Rives at least right that this is pseudoscience with no basis in the peer-reviewed literature? First, let's recall that Dawkins adopted the phrase self-feeding coevolution for the duration of a 50-minute lecture, not as a formal term we'd expect to find in the literature. However, both he and Rives make it clear that we're talking about evolutionary arms races just under a different name. And that is a term you'll find all over the scientific journals. Consider, for example, the article Predator versus Prey on Aerial Hunting and Escape Strategies in Birds. Published in 2001, it takes as a given that coevolutionary arms races can and do occur, that it is already generally considered the best explanation for the specifics of both predatory birds and their avian prey. The paper goes on over an extensive body of previous work and data collected on these animals to test this model. Unsurprisingly, it stands up to the data, confirming Dawkins' point in 1991 that what he there called self-feeding is our best explanation for our modern hawks and ducks. You can find a link to the full article in the description. Beyond this, Dawkins has, over his numerous works, provided a multitude of other examples of evolutionary arms races. Just check the index of The Greatest Show on Earth, The Blind Watchmaker, or The Extended Phenotype. So saying that he has no examples other than human inventions is disingenuous in the extreme. Setting Dawkins aside, since he's neither the bishop of biology nor the Ayatollah of atheism, a short perusal of even Wikipedia will find you half a dozen examples or more, all of which are backed up by references to the peer-reviewed literature. This is not a new idea. It is not a far-fetched idea. It is a well-developed part of our larger model of evolutionary theory, and it has passed far more strenuous tests than the David Rives Ministries Science Division can hope to muster.
Now let's move on to the nitty-gritty and see if there is any way to assume that this would work on a biological level. When talking about evolution, even the most adamant professor would admit that they rely on mutations, adaptation, and natural selection to do the work.
Okay, you used some of the right terms, and we can, at a high level, work with this. Let's be clear and get an understanding of what these terms actually mean in biology from a reputable source. My ever-handy copy of the Oxford Dictionary of Biology. Mutations are any sudden random change to the genetic material of a cell that potentially can cause it and all cells derived from it to differ in appearance or behavior, i.e. in phenotype, from the normal type. Natural selection is the process that, according to Darwinism, brings about the evolution of new species of plants and animals. When differences in the phenotypes of a species occur, such as through mutations, natural selection is a high-level description of the notion that those differences which help an animal survive and reproduce will become more prevalent in the population, while those that are detrimental will become less prevalent. Given enough time and enough selection pressure, a new species may result from the accumulation of these changes. And adaptations are any change in the structure or functioning of successive generations of a population that make it better suited to its environment. Put in the context of our previous terms, adaptations are the result of natural selection acting on variations produced through various mechanisms, in particular mutations. It's obvious from this that you can't separate these three aspects out and treat them individually. You have to address them as a system, because that's what evolution is, a system by which successive generations react to environmental pressures. An evolutionary arms race is merely an example of where the relationship between or amongst species is part of the environmental pressure on those species. Hawks killing ducks puts pressure on the duck population. Ducks that happen to have mutations that help them evade hawks will live longer and breed more. As a result, mutant phenotypes are adaptations of the duck population because the hawk population eats the ducks. It should already be apparent how this works in the other direction, as without food, hawks will starve and fail to breed. Thus, ducks that evade hawks place selection pressure on the hawk population, favoring any mutations that help hawks catch ducks. producing adaptations in the hawk population. When it's that simple, there is no way David Rives can cock it up, right?
Let's take natural selection. If we speed that up, what would happen? Well, natural selection is closely linked to the survival of the fittest. It's an idea that does have plenty of merit. For instance, the largest grizzly bears are pretty fit and they survive pretty well. But the way natural selection supposedly selects is by nature weeding out the weak. And by that, I mean death. If we rapidly speed up the death of our example hawks and ducks, it's not going to speed up their reproduction or their birth rate. It's going to effectively cull the species to extinction. So natural selection is not going to work.
Can I answer this by just posting a clip of the little old lady saying, "That's not how this works"?
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
So, first of all, obviously, we have the problem of decoupling natural selection from variation. It is not, despite Rives' lies, simply death, but the death of those less fit to the environment. In the case of the ducks, it would be the ducks who couldn't evade the hawks, leaving ducks that evaded the hawks to reproduce more, as they have fewer slow ducks to compete with for fucking and feeding. In the case of the hawks, it would be those that can catch the ducks, leaving only hawks that could prevent enough ducks from evading capture to allow them enough nutrition needed to reproduce, and at the same time removing competition for mates and more ducks to eat, as the slower, weaker, or otherwise less well-suited hawks starve and die. And so, after a few generations, both ducks and hawks will, on average, be better suited to evading hawks and capturing ducks, respectively. Both may well be faster, while ducks will likely be smaller, better able to climb rapidly to evade dive attacks, and more alert to shadows falling ahead of them, suggesting a predator in the sky above them. The hawks that survive, in contrast, are liable to be larger, to use their greater weight to knock the duck right out of the air, better able to judge when to give up a pursuit if the duck is evading too quickly from the initial attack, and equipped with larger, sharper talons than prior generations in order to grab their prey more securely. Oh, I guess I've already addressed the issue of adaptations then.
What about mutations? Well, if we increase the mutation rate, then it's also going to increase the death rate, as most mutations are at best non-beneficial, at worst lethal, and the ones that don't kill will aggregate over time and then destroy the species. So let's say we zap the hawk with radiation and we get a rapid mutation rate with a few beneficial mutations. Well, unless you happen to zap the duck with the same radiation gun, you're not going to get an equal acceleration of mutations in the duck, so it will never become a self-feeding chain reaction.
Once more, a complete misrepresentation of how we expect shit to work. Nobody is proposing an increased rate of mutation or zapping anybody with a radiation gun. Rather, what we'd be seeing is greater importance on even the smallest changes in speed, weight, or judgment. Anything that gives you a little bit of an advantage. And, for that matter, previously neutral mutations, say speed of a duck in a hawkless environment, suddenly become positive mutations instead. The relative quality and importance of a mutation is determined by the environment within which a population of animals finds itself. In an environment with predators, ducks will need every scrap of advantage they can find. And as those ducks suddenly stop becoming an easy meal, the hawks find themselves in the same boat. Every ounce of speed, every advantage in death grip may make the difference between having babies or starving to death. In no way does the scenario involve the rate of mutations necessarily changing, only the relative importance of certain types of mutations to the survival of hawks and ducks. Beyond that, the assumption that aggregates of mutations are necessarily dangerous is just plain ignorant. The overwhelming majority of the differences in your DNA from a fellow human's DNA started at one point or another with a mutation.
Well, we still got one more that could salvage the naturalistic idea of rapid evolutionary upward self-feeding, and that's adaptation. Adaptation is a switching on and off of genetic switches. It's already built into the DNA, the makeup of the creature. The genes are expressing themselves differently. Now, it gets a bit deeper than this when we start distinguishing between the phenotype and the genotype levels. There's a chance that it could provide the creature with some advantage in a given circumstance. Maybe we figured it out. But how do you speed up genetic changes? The duck can't mentally go, I need to develop different length wings to dodge these hawks more effectively. Nothing would happen. Evolution wouldn't magically take place, and it certainly wouldn't magically set a more rapid pace just because the duck realized its need. Ducks falling out of the sky as hawk prey wouldn't magically stimulate genetic changes in the ducks that hadn't been attacked yet. No known natural process is going to create a self-feeding, rapid evolutionary chain.
If it weren't patently obvious, Rives is confusing adaptations with epigenetics when he discusses the switching on and off of genes. And while there is some preliminary evidence that this might sometimes be transmissible from parents to children, it is not part of what biologists call adaptation. As previously shown, adaptation is the consequence of generations of phenotypic changes, often due to mutations being filtered through the sieve of natural selection. Adaptations are our faster hawks and ducks, which we've demonstrated could be produced by the heightened importance given to mutations that increase flight speed due to selective pressure of hawks killing ducks and ducks starving hawks by escaping. This creates a feedback system where, at least up to some point, both hawks and ducks continue to get faster, generation after generation, all through well-understood mechanisms for well-understood reasons, which flew well over David Rives' head. I feel we need to take a moment to remind David Rives that none of this is magic. It's an incredibly mechanistic process that requires nothing spectacular at all. It's not as if we're suggesting that some infinite entity spoke a word and all of creation unfurled before him. David, you're the one who believes in magic, so I encourage you not to use it as mockery of science you simply don't understand.
Bottom line, is self-feeding real? Absolutely. It's the end product of mental stimulation, a mind, an intelligence. But a rapid spiral of self-feeding upwards biological evolution in the natural world? That's pseudoscience, a clever device created only in the brain of a mere mortal to try and explain something that he can't quite grasp. It goes against everything that we know through science and observation. It's ludicrous to even imagine. So why did Dawkins and other atheists come up with such creative mental rescuing devices to explain what they observe in the natural world? Is it perhaps because they're looking only to their precious Darwinian mechanisms to explain the entire collection of life on this planet? They've purposely discounted and disregarded any other explanation. I think that's a detriment to the scientific community. Now, even if someone doesn't agree with my position, specific intelligent design by the God of the Bible, it's always curious how willing they are to accept a magical, anti-naturalistic principle like self-feeding to explain their beliefs. That's pseudoscience.
I'm a little tired of having to reiterate this. Darwin and evolution are independent of atheism. You can have an adult understanding of biology, accepting evolutionary theory, and be a Christian. You can be an atheist and reject a scientific understanding of the universe. I hope I've demonstrated plainly that feedback systems can happen in evolution. In fact, it's essentially what is predicted by the theory. Further, I'd like to think that I've demonstrated why David Rives is wrong about hawks and ducks specifically, and that David Rives blatantly misrepresented Dawkins in all of this, as well as presenting a patently false understanding of evolutionary processes, thinking as well as the state of the science. In the end, this is necessary on his part because intelligent design is an empty concept. It is ill-designed and as such cannot be tested empirically. Whenever something in nature doesn't fit with the notion of being an intelligent design, it's an expression of the creator's artistic whimsy, or some other similar daft line of bullshit. Creationists are left relying on a bad education, theirs or yours, misinformation, and outright lies. I'm InaneDragon, telling you, don't feed the Rives. Good night.